So Sarah, why this briefing and why now?
Thanks, Alex. Well, of course, COP26 is on a lot of people's minds at the moment, not just because of events that are taking place in Glasgow, but in the last few months, we have seen an increased number of regulations and consultations about climate change, not just in the UK, but globally. Governments on their own are not going to be able to achieve net zero. It's down to all of us to play our part. And investors have a particularly important role to play in ensuring that their investee companies are actually standing up to the commitments they are making. So we're seeing that investors have increased obligations on ESG, stewardship, and climate change. And in the next few months, what we will see is an increased volume of information coming out from companies about their commitments to the Paris Agreement, how they're going to achieve net zero, and that's going to be integral to investment stewardship. So the Minerva briefing covers some of the high-level regulatory issues that we've been observing over the last 18 to 24 months, and then drilling down that complexity into a very simple and accessible user guide to help people frame their thinking about their stewardship policy, whether that's monitoring companies or monitoring what their fund managers are doing. We've pulled together a lot of the jargon and tried to do a bit of myth busting about the complexity to make it as accessible as possible.
Brilliant. So it really brings together a lot of the key information for Minerva clients and the market as a whole. What do you want Minerva's clients to get out of this briefing and respond to in the adjoined survey that's been released? Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So in addition to the background briefing to climate change voting and shareholder resolutions on climate change, we've also introduced for the first time a survey which is asking the market what they think are the most material issues for consideration when they're actually looking at shareholder voting. Not all companies are going to have shareholder resolutions on climate, and so from that perspective, shareholders may wish to use other resolutions to express their views about the appropriateness of the climate stewardship that companies themselves are actually putting forward. So whether or not people are going to be wanting to vote on report and accounts, climate change specific resolutions, they need to really be thinking about the policy issues which are actually going to be triggering their decisions to escalate, or whether or not it's going to be a basis of support. So there is a plethora of information. Actually, in some respects, there's almost too much information out there. There are a lot of competing initiatives, some of which seem to be the same, some of them are slightly different. We've got TCFD, Transition Pathway Initiative, Science-Based Targets Initiative, GFANZ, IIGCC. And for most shareholders, this is actually really very bewildering. There are almost too many initiatives to grapple. What we've done is distill that down into a very easy to use guide, and now shareholders' opportunity to say, well, actually, when I'm thinking about this is what's actually most important. We're not trying to create a new one-size-fits-all framework. What we're actually trying to do is fit people's expectations and beliefs into what is available. So from the complex down to the more straightforward and accessible, bearing in mind that different countries around the world are at different states of development on climate change and ESG disclosure.
Brilliant. That was really well put. I think it shows that Minerva doesn't want to take on that one-size-fits-all approach and really wants to listen to the needs of the market and the needs of our clients. So talking about not creating anything new, as you put it, what history does Minerva have in addressing climate change as part of its stewardship services? Is this recent briefing and the related stakeholder survey on climate stewardship and voting something new for Minerva, or is it a continuation of past processes?
That's an interesting question. So the Say on Climate briefing is really a culmination of a series of things that Minerva has been doing over the last 7 years. We initially created a framework called Say on Sustainability, which was designed to look fully across the piece at what companies were doing on a range of sustainability factors, whether that was health and safety issues, whether it was tax sensitivity, alignment with SDGs, really a very comprehensive framework, which itself was grounded in academic research as to what were the most material factors. Over the last 7 years, we've evolved and developed that process. We're now incorporating, for example, ESG norms, the EU taxonomy, etc. We always had questions around greenhouse gas emissions, and we've been collecting our own climate change data now for 7 years. At the time of the annual report production, and this is actually a critical issue, is that a lot of the data that's been published by NGOs is not timely. We wanted to ensure that companies were disclosing this information at the time of the annual report so that clients could consider this as part of their normal routine assessment. But what's happened in the last 18 months as COP26 has been developed and put forward and the IPCC reports have been published is this renewed urgency for a transition to a low carbon economy, which can't just be done by governments alone. We've all got, finance is going to play a very important part of it. And it's very clear that a considered pivot towards a low carbon economy is also what is needed as well. So rather than just a very blunt divestment, which might decarbonise a portfolio, but it doesn't necessarily decarbonise the world. It's about saying climate is a risk issue and risk is risk. Therefore, it should be considered just like any other risk indicator. So we're now treating climate just like any other risk. And if boards are not disclosing what they're doing about climate risk, I think that's a real concern for shareholders. So say on climate, say on sustainability, to us it's all part of a continuum, and the climate stewardship briefing also coincides with our commitment to net zero. So as part of the GFANZ initiative around COP26, a group of service providers, index providers such as our parent company Solactive, at Minerva as a proxy voting service provider, we've all come together and made a commitment that all aspects of our services will be embracing net zero so that we can help our clients achieve their objectives to achieve net zero as well. Bear in mind that climate change is part of a very complex, interconnected range of issues. It has been called one of the most wicked problems that human beings have ever had to contend with. So I think for people to have too much of a narrow one-track mind about climate change, that's not going to be helpful either. There are a number of implications of a transition to a low carbon economy. There is no point just reaching a net zero target if along the way a number of the other ESG norms are going to be affected. And this is where you see the EU taxonomy. It's not just about climate change. The Financial Conduct Authority is not just looking at climate change, and the ACC, it's not just looking at climate change. It's how these issues actually mesh together with one another. And that's where the Minerva Nexus framework is so important. It doesn't matter which country is producing what framework, we've created effectively a Rosetta Stone, which translates these different frameworks so that we can, for example, say, this is how France is approaching it, this is how Spain is approaching it, and our system is actually uniquely capable of supporting that diversity of viewpoint.
Exactly. And that leads immediately to my next thought, which is, as you mentioned, Minerva highly values diversity in its approach. How is this new stakeholder survey that we're discussing today an iteration of that?
What we're doing is we're asking a series of questions about what issues people currently feel are important to them. We are exposed through our day-to-day work to a whole range and a variety of issues, but we also appreciate that we're cursed with information. We've almost got too much of it, and we need to understand where the market is at today so that we're picking on the issues which have the most impact and salience for investors now, but keeping an eye on the horizon in terms of what is actually coming down the pipeline. We've got to be able to accommodate where we are today with where we might be in 5 years' time. Because regulation, as we've seen through the corporate governance lens, literally every 2 years there has been a refinement and a reiteration of principles or guidelines. And this is where principles-based regulation is very different to the rules-based regulation that maybe some markets are used to. And in principles-based regulation, it's people articulating their particular vision of how they're going to adopt this, rather than just saying, oh, here's a menu of items, I've done tick, 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 these 5 things, therefore I'm good to go. That's not going to work in the future. TCFD is a principle-based framework. Everybody needs to be able to articulate their story. And so therefore we need to actually understand across a range of issues where people are at the moment, what issues do they think are most important now. I do anticipate that we will run this survey again in a couple of years' time, just to see how people's thinking has evolved as a consequence of just being exposed to the new climate change information. Mustn't forget, for maybe 80% of the market, a lot of this is brand new material. So we shouldn't be automatically assuming that because we are understanding an issue in the depth that we do, that everybody is necessarily in the same place yet. So this is just an opportunity for us to take soundings, see where the rest of the market is at, make sure that we're aligned, and really help build the voting guidelines in a way that actually is sufficiently flexible to be able to accommodate these different points of view.
Brilliant. If we come back to the bigger picture, this Minerva briefing comes at a time where the ESG scene is rapidly changing, but some particular changes that come to mind are the recent consultation from DWP and the UK Treasury's announced roadmap addressing climate change and finance. So set against that backdrop, what do you think are the biggest takeaways from these developments, and how does it tie into Minerva's approach?
So I think what we're seeing here, probably for the first time, at least in my 30 plus years in financial services, is that we've got a very joined up approach to regulation coming from DWT, Treasury and the Financial Reporting Council. And what they're also doing is putting stewardship and voting at the very heart of achieving these objectives. And I think since the global financial crisis, we've seen this greater understanding of how stewardship is a very important part in maintaining market hygiene and ensuring long-term sustainable success. So I was very struck by how stewardship really is at the heart of this, where historically it may have been seen as a peripheral issue. That's really changing. What we're also seeing is that asset owners are the ones who are being given the regulatory obligations to start with, almost as pump primers for actually getting the rest of the market to change. So it's very much a case that we're all in this together. And what we've got to remember is who is the ultimate client in this? And that's the investors, and how we're going to help the investors achieve their objectives for long-term sustainable returns. And I think one of our clients, Brunel, has actually said this very well. It's about having good pensions in a world worth living in. That's the ultimate outcome, not just thinking 3 or 6 months down the line, but 10, 20, 30 years down the line, when today's savers who are just starting out on their pension savings journey, when they retire in 40, 50 years' time, there's no point having the best returns if the environment that they're living in is just going to be unhealthy. So we do see this as a long-term objective, a long-term mission, and putting all the building blocks in place to actually make that a reality. This is probably one of the biggest shifts in investment that I've ever seen since I started my career in the early 80s. At the one time, there's a lot to take in, and that can seem a little bit daunting to start with. But it's actually also very exciting because we've actually got new things to consider, new opportunities to become invested in. It isn't all doom and gloom. I think people should take this away, that it is not just about climate catastrophe. It would be very easy to fall into a catastrophic mindset and thinking that the only thing that can be done is immediate divestment and some kind of tailspin into an archaic pre-modern existence. I think all of the regulators globally are actually saying, how is technology and how is investment actually going to spur this transition to a low carbon economy? That means there are going to be exciting new opportunities along the way. So it's not all about bad news. Yes, it's worrying if we do not get on this journey as quickly as possible. We've probably lost a good 20 years to take steps to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. But if we act now, we have got some fantastic opportunities ahead. We've learned the lessons from the past, from previous pivots. So embrace the new opportunities. We're all going to have difficulties from time to time. None of us actually know what the future holds and what the outcomes of this are going to be. But what I can say is that for really the last 7 years, Minerva has been preparing for this moment, putting the systems in place, putting the people in place, the training to make sure that the technology and our people, our analysts, know what to do and have got the tools ready to help our clients achieve their objectives.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for talking with me today and for introducing the new climate stewardship briefing from Minerva.
Thank you very much, Alex. It's been a pleasure.